Welcome to a new edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we discuss the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. Finding balance. In this segment of the show, I want to talk about really the main goal of the Shinsei method and why I developed the Shinsei method. Recall the Shinsei method, loosely translated from the Japanese, means Shin, which means principle, being, or mind. Sei, which means life principle. It's the life principle method of training. Why life principle and why training? Number one, because what I found in my decades-long, over 50 years old, and over my decades-long experience in college, school, management, the workforce, consulting, advising, raising a family, being married, in other words, life. From the various areas of life to various areas of life, what I've found is that there's not a lot of instruction, particularly practical instruction, for the important and most crucial decisions of life. Marriage. If I had had really the kind of Shinsei method when I was younger, I would have made very different choices, for example, when I was married, and that would have prevented a lot of the other subsequent difficulties that came, psychological, financial, and then, of course, emotional, which I have to point out, all of which have to be rectified or corrected in some degree if you want to hope to achieve any level of success. That's another reason I developed the Shinsei method, because people often use the word, for example, success. They throw it around. It's very often used. It's this very, very widespread word. But typically what people do when they're talking about success, they measure it in terms of financial success, and usually that's measured in terms of things like career, neighborhood, home size, car value, a lot of times financial value. But what I've found, particularly in these times when we're faced with a pandemic, which is really a health crisis, which is a crisis. Whenever you face a crisis, one of the most important aspects of facing that crisis and achieving a level of success. Now, when I say success, I mean something very specific. I'm not talking about just financial. That can be a measure of success. But what I encourage people to do, what I encourage you to do if you're watching this show or listening to this show at theshinseimethod.com, is to evaluate words for yourself, to define those words and use your own premises when you're evaluating what something means, like success. Because success is not always measured in terms of financial success. Let's say, for example, during this financial or this health crisis, which could be very easily a financial crisis, it certainly is an employment crisis. But let's say that the health crisis leads into a financial crisis. All of the people, number one, all of the people who might be considered to be wealthy may lose all of that wealth. So suddenly they're not successful anymore. But they're not successful by dint of something that's beyond their control. So when you think about how you're evaluating success, it's important to evaluate success from your own perspective. Because if you are measuring success in terms of, let's say in an external way, if you're going by what other people say are success, you're faced with a health crisis, a financial crisis, and you lose all of your money is wiped out. Or let's say you are a business owner and most of your wealth is tied up in your business and your business is ordered to shut down. That's beyond your control. Now all of your wealth is gone. Are you successful? Potentially. It depends on really what your situation is, your financial too, but not only financial. I really want to get away from just measuring something as important as success only in terms of financial success. I'll give another example. Let's say that you're a wealthy person, but you have heart disease and you're given 6 months to live. How would you measure success in that case? It's a rhetorical question. Most people would say that they would not measure success strictly in financial terms if they were in those situations. A lot of times when you're faced with a health crisis, it really brings things down to its essentials. That's how I want to encourage you to evaluate words, particularly success, for yourself. Bring it down to its essentials. Evaluate things based upon, as I like to do, in terms of value. But it's not value in financial, only in a financial sense. It can be. Sometimes the inner value leads to greater financial value. Now, you can also measure yourself in terms of success based on that. How do I feel about myself? How do I feel about those around me? Who is in my life? How do I interact with them? Do I feel effective at what I'm doing? Do I feel effective in how I communicate? Now, these are all important questions to ask, and you're very rarely given instruction on how to ask those kinds of questions when it makes a difference. For example, when you're young, particularly when you're very young and you're living with your family and you don't have the responsibilities of career and children and parenting and taxes, property, other kinds of things that will bear on you, which of course take away from your attention and focusing on building up that storehouse of value. So when I talk about the Shinsei method, I'm talking about building up a storehouse of value. But I'm talking about it in a very specific way. That storehouse of value is you. And that's what's important to understand. And you don't get that in many social situations. Quite the contrary and quite the opposite. You're encouraged to define various words, let's say yourself, the I behind me. What does that mean in practical terms? Have you thought about that before? It's not just a semantic question. What I also encourage people to do when they're listening to the show at theshinseimethod.com, when they're watching the show online, and when they're thinking about what the Shinsei method means, what I encourage people to do again is define words for yourself and use the standards that you create for yourself to evaluate those words. That's the Shinsei method in a nutshell. I devised it really as a reference, as a waypoint, as a guide, because I found, like I said, throughout my life, there's not a lot of practical instruction, even if you have parents, even if you have two good parents that stay together, which I did not, and many families don't, because most marriages, at least in America, end up in divorce, which means broken families, obviously. So it's very different, though, let's say in Japan, where most families tend to stay together. So you have a mother and a father usually. Now, that can make a difference, but not always. Very often, parents don't instruct their children on how to confront reality, how to face certain things like a crisis, how to evaluate what's important, how to make certain decisions in life, which are very crucial to your overall life and the longevity of your life on many levels. Your stress level, which is directly tied for your ability to earn a living that you feel satisfied with. And you can do all of that. You can, let's say, choose a career, but it might bring you financial, quote, success. In other words, it may allow you to live in the neighborhood you want to live in. It may allow you to buy the house that you want, but at what cost? Obviously, there's always a trade-off. What cost is it? How do you measure that cost? How do you measure that benefit? It's important to ask those questions, because what I've also found is a lot of times people are in careers that they don't like. It doesn't bring them a lot of satisfaction. They dread going into the office, but they force themselves to do it. And that says something about those people, because it does say something about motivation. If you're motivating and pushing yourself to go into work that you don't really like, that puts you in a very different category from other people who steal. The trouble is, particularly during a crisis, and you see it, you hear stories about let's say, prisoners being let out, all while property owners or law-abiding citizens are being prevented from social gatherings like church, and they're being arrested, taking these very draconian approaches. Now, in those cases, people don't have to be arrested. If you were in a much more balanced environment, instead of people being arrested because they went to church or had church services, even if it was against a stay-at-home order, police could talk to them, like they often do, and I've often seen them do with hardcore criminals. They talk to them. They try not to arrest them. They try to really set them on a different path. Now, in the case of criminals, that usually doesn't work. The criminals take advantage of it and exploit it, as well as they exploit these times. But the law-abiding citizens, the churchgoers, the Christians very often will follow along, and they will go along and follow directions. It's just that in the cases where I've heard that people have been arrested because they've gone to church, church was important. But think about what church means. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that they're going to partake in a fellowship with concepts, practices, and ideas that are ethically oriented, that are morally oriented. In other words, they're really going to partake in the building up of constructive values. Now, if you ask yourself, what types of people make a greater contribution to a society? Those types of people, or people who look for the easy way out? They want to steal, they want to get on welfare instead of finding work, etc., etc. Now, I'm bringing this up not to be morally evaluative, although sometimes you have to do that. You have to really judge for yourself. A lot of times when you're making choices and making conscientious decisions, there's a moral component to it. In other words, this is the good for me, this will be good, and then you have some explanation, you have some idea about why that's going to be good. What I encourage people to do, what I encourage you to do, is to evaluate that and to define that for yourself. Now, I'm not talking about relativism. This doesn't mean that there's a relative good and it changes from everyone, from person to person. To some extent, that's true. But there is a sense of justice and there is a sense of fairness that people do have a commonality to understand. There is a common understanding of justice and fairness and balance. Not coincidentally, that's one of the three pillars of what I call the three pillars of individuality, well-being, profitability, inner strength, inner balance, self-trust. Everything that I do on this show and everything I do at the shinseimethod.com is always oriented toward establishing a policy, practice, and procedure for building inner strength, inner balance, self-trust. So when we're talking about finding balance, everything that I've just said up to this point, that's what finding balance is all about. It's really defining balance for yourself in your life in a way that makes sense, that really is not so terribly influenced by the external world, what's going on in society, what's going on in many social situations. Because in many social situations, there's a lot of pressure on you as an individual not to take this path. Not to take a path toward more balance, more strength, more trust, more trustworthy behavior, more self-trust, more self-belief. Building up an inner core, a storehouse of value from within. And that includes things like self-trust, inner balance, inner strength. And an important component of that is competence. Building up a level of competence. So if you think about everything that I've just described and discussed in this segment of the show, you can understand why I developed the Shinsei method to be a method of training. Because everything you do is training. How you think, how you behave, how you interact, it's all training. The only question is that training producing the kind of results that you find to be desirable, that will help you through or to face a crisis, to develop a plan that works for you, that will navigate through a crisis, through a storm. A storm is really a metaphor for a crisis. And I find that in many social situations throughout school and many other really sources that say that they will help you to do that don't, because they're impractical. They don't really encourage and accentuate the reality of the facts on the ground, what's actually going on. Let's say in a crisis, you're faced in a crisis where there's a lot of information that's not valid. This crisis that we're faced with today, this pandemic, we were started out by being told that it was going to have a very high death toll, and that was the primary justification for really a shutdown of practically the entire economy, except for certain things. And so the government propped itself up to be the arbiter of what was essential and what wasn't essential. So you had really an arbitrary and very subjective evaluation of what was essential and what wasn't essential. So a lot of people who would feel very strongly that their business, that their livelihoods were essential, were told that it wasn't essential. Now think about the they smack to your psychological and emotional well-being in that case. Now you're going along, let's say for decades, thinking that your business is an essential business. It's really providing the food for your family. It's giving you a sense of personal satisfaction, that storehouse of value, the inner storehouse of value I was talking about. And suddenly from the external world, the government, local governments mainly, told you it wasn't, told you to shut down. Now that created a lot of uncertainty. You don't know if you'll be able to open up your business, if you do open it up, whether or not you'll be able to survive. And it's a very precarious situation, and you won't know what the near or long-term future will bring. That's uncertainty. Now what helps you to face that kind of crisis? Inner strength, inner balance, self-trust. Finding balance is really what helps you. But you can't do it in these times, and that's really the trouble. And that's one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method, because in many cases, school, for example, the first introduction that many people have to training and to the idea of training in this development of value, inner value, a storehouse of value, and competence is an important value. The first introduction that many people have toward this idea of training is school. And school generally instructs, and really there's a lot of pressure on you, if not coercion, for you not to develop an inner balance, inner strength, and self-trust. To trust what other people are doing. And what you're being taught is not to seek principle, not to understand principle, not to evaluate facts for yourself independently. That's really the American tradition, by the way. There used to be a saying of truth, justice, and the American way. It was understood that truth, justice, fairness, independence, balance, these were all important elements of the founding documents of America. It was really important, those were important themes, let's say in one of the founding books of this, two of the founding books of this great nation, Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, and the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Now, these two books are often cited here and there, but I didn't spend any time reading any of those books to any great extent throughout school. It may have been referred to in some textbook loosely, and generally if it was referred to, if either of those books were referred to, it was a hypercritical and demeaning evaluation that was given. That was somehow, those books they didn't really quite get it right. It was always the theme in many of the college classes. Well, if this is your approach, if this is the value system that is being smuggled in when you're being trained, you can't expect then when you're faced with a crisis to suddenly have independence. It hasn't been developed. One of the things that I learned when I was studying martial arts and self-defense, particularly personal combat, and I spent many years doing that, and I continue to do that because it's crucial. But one of the things that I realized, that when you're fighting and when you're learning self-defense, for example, you are faced with, let's say, unfortunately, if you're faced with a violent assailant. At that moment, you have to confront an emergency, much like a health crisis, right? A health crisis happens. There's no warning to it. You have to go with what you have at that moment. And the only thing that you can use up to that moment is the training that you've received up to that moment. So that's why training is so crucial and why I developed the Shinsei method and built the Shinsei method as a method that understood that training was the crucial element in self-development, leadership, and really competence building, this building up this storehouse of value. That's why I developed the Shinsei method as a method of training. To see it and understand it as a method of training, and that you begin by training yourself in these fundamental principles, in these fundamental attitudes and perspectives, long before you have to face a crisis. And that's how you manage a crisis. That's how you manage a crisis in a self-defense situation. Train yourself in self-defense long before you need it. Hopefully you never will. Train yourself to be ready for a crisis, if not materially. Sometimes you can't. I mean, you can't always be completely prepared, let's say, for a fire. You can have a fire extinguisher or know how to use it, know where it's located. But if you live in an apartment, that becomes very difficult to achieve. But knowing how having that in your house becomes really a step, at least, in that direction. But if you can't do that, over a period of time, then what you can do is understand that building up this storehouse of value, those three pillars of value, inner strength and about self-trust, building that up from within at least gives you that foundation for facing a crisis and being able to manage it and develop a plan in a sequential way that's going to yield the most desirable results in the long run. And I talk about and how to do that, how to make these kind of decisions, what I did personally and continue to do to build that up so that when you are faced with a crisis, at least you could say to yourself, I have some idea of what I can do, and if I don't have some idea at the moment, I can develop a plan. At least I have that level of self-trust and ultimately inner strength and a balance. And that really is, in my opinion, the best you can hope to do. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we discuss the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.